Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome to Adventures in History. Today's topic is Abraham Lincoln, Part 5, Illinois Country Lawyer. We stopped last time in 1854. Abraham Lincoln was practicing law in Springfield, Illinois, and in the local circuit. And he was enjoying married life with his wife Mary and their two sons. They'd lost a child already. And he was giving speeches as well. He was becoming a public speaker, and the debate over slavery was growing more intense. And in 1854, Abraham Lincoln gave a speech in Bloomington, Illinois. There was a crowd of Germans who were against the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was allowing the possibility of slavery to enter the Northwest Territories. And this was very unpopular. Abraham Lincoln at this speech declared that Southern slaveholders were neither better nor worse than the people in the North. He did not believe in demonizing the people in the South or slave owners. And he said, quote, "If we were situated as they are, we should act and feel as they do. And if they were situated as we are, they should act and feel as we do." Many folks in the North wanted to vilify Southerners, and Abraham Lincoln was pleading for understanding. He also talked about Thomas Jefferson, who owned slaves but was against slavery in the Northwest Territories. And he talked about the Compromise of 1820, which limited slavery to the 36-degree latitude south of that line. Now, Stephen Douglas, who became Lincoln's big debate partner over the issue in the coming years, as the 1850s passed. He had been the author and promoter of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, so he was promoting this whole idea, which was so controversial. And Douglas was a very famous politician and growing in power. Lincoln biographer Ronald C. White Jr. wrote, quote, "Whoever dared challenge Stephen Douglas would inevitably create a large space for himself." Beginning in late 1854, Abraham Lincoln stepped into that space. He would challenge Douglas again and again in the coming months and years. Regarding Abraham Lincoln's speeches, which were more frequent, which he did along with his legal career, biographer Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote, quote, "For the first time in his public life, Abraham Lincoln's remarkable array of gifts as historian, storyteller, and teacher, combined with a lucid, relentless, yet always accessible logic." Now, in one of the speeches, Lincoln gave a little history lesson. He talked about how in 1808 the slave trade had been declared illegal, and in 1820, quote, "Congress declared the slave trade piracy and annexed to it the extreme penalty of death. Thus we see that the plain, unmistakable spirit of the age towards slavery was hostility to the principle and toleration only by necessity." Lincoln gave a speech at the Illinois State Fair in Springfield and said, quote, Distinction between slavery as an existing institution and extension of slavery." He discussed that, again, he was making a distinction that, okay, we have slavery, but the question, which he accepted slavery, but he didn't want it extended. And he talked about how Thomas Jefferson, who owned slaves, did not believe that slavery should be extended into the Northwest. Now, these speeches he was challenging Stephen Douglas, who wanted to expand slavery, or at least as far as the Kansas-Nebraska Act and that political action which he led. But these speeches were becoming part of the national debate over slavery, and Lincoln was becoming nationally known through them. Biographer William Lee Miller wrote, quote, "If we are aroused to deal with the wrongs, evils, and injustices of the world, then we want to blame and simplicity. We prefer villains, the menace of the slave power, for example. If, on the other hand, we are told that responsibility is diffused and we are included in it, and that the evils are complicated and hugely resistant, not soon to be overcome, then our will diminishes. Our interest flags and turns elsewhere." See, this is a great comment that he made here, because there were folks, the abolitionists, who wanted to vilify Southerners or slave owners. And the thing is, slavery was a major reason. Economic reason was growing cotton, which was the most valuable raw material at the time. For the biggest industry of that time, textiles or cloth was profitable industry, and so they were making money from that. So the folks and folks in the North, there were textile mills in the North, which were buying this cotton, which had been cultivated and picked by slaves in the South. And as we know now, with their human trafficking, 2021, slavery isn't gone, and slavery itself is based on human beings, not being kind to each other. It's horrible. And so, again, this is a great comment that he's making. We want to blame, oh, this is terrible, but this is an issue. It's a very deep issue. Slavery at that time was much deeper than people realized. It was how human beings treat each other. And here we are, it's 2021, 170 years later, and we're still having this issue of human beings being cruel to each other, so anyway, people don't want to hear about that. They just want to blame, because people don't want to admit that they're part of the problem, and we all really are. Another speech by Lincoln, he said, quote, "When Southern people tell us they are no more responsible for the origin of slavery than we, I acknowledge the fact. When it is said that the institution exists and that it is very difficult to get rid of in any satisfactory way, I can understand and appreciate the saying. I surely will not blame them for not doing what I should not know how to do myself." See, these people had been mistreated for so long. They looked very different. They had a different cultural background. There was a fear of the anger in slaves because of when they were degraded by slavery. There was a fear they would seek revenge, so it was not an easy situation. Obviously, it was very wrong. And, Lincoln gave speeches, and one of the speech he gave, he condemned slavery. Yeah, he did condemn it, that it was absolutely wrong, and this, of course, did offend a lot of folks in the South. And he referred to the Bible, where Adam was expelled from the Garden of Eden to earn his bread by the sweat of his brow, and not someone else's brow, that we all need to work, and with slavery, people are benefiting from the work of others. The Whig Party, 1854, and the Democratic Party both were declining and dividing over slavery. Those who opposed the extension of slavery were leaving the Whigs and the Democrats to join the rising Republican Party. There was an argument, one of the arguments about this whole issue of slavery in the Northwest, that Stephen Douglas made the case that this was self-government, that the people in these new, as states were joining the Union, first starting with Kansas, that they should have the right to decide whether or not they could have slavery, and he called it self-government. Now Lincoln said, quote, "It all depends on whether a Negro is not or is a man. When the white man governs himself, that is self-government. But when he governs another man, that is more than self-government, that is despotism." Biographer Ronald C. White, Jr. wrote, quote, "Abraham Lincoln believed America was witnessing a march backward from the moral values of the Declaration of Independence." See, Lincoln made the case that the Founding Fathers tolerated slavery. It existed, and it was tolerated, but they did not want it to spread and to grow throughout as the country expanded, and that's exactly what was happening. In 1854, Abraham Lincoln was elected to the Illinois legislature again. However, he declined to take that seat. He was interested in running for the U.S. Senate. Another speech, Lincoln apologized for his odd appearance. He was kind of awkward-looking, very tall, and had kind of a clumsy appearance, and not considered good-looking. And so he had a very good self-deprecating humor. And he said that he felt like an ugly man riding through the woods who met a woman on horseback. He was telling a story, and the woman said, quote, "Well, for land's sake, you're the homeliest man I ever saw." And then the man says, "Yes, madam, but I can't help it." And she responds, "No, I suppose not, but you might stay at home." Good, another one of his jokes. Now, regarding slavery, Lincoln said in 1855, quote, "On the question of liberty as a principle, we are not what we have been. When we were the political slaves of King George and we wanted to be free, we called the maxim, 'All men are created equal,' a self-evident truth. But now, when we have grown fat and have lost all dread of being slaves ourselves, we have become so greedy to be masters that we call the same maxim a self-evident lie. The 4th of July has not quite dwindled away. It is still a great day for burning firecrackers. Our political problem: can we as a nation continue together permanently forever, half slave and half free?" Lincoln talked about the time he saw 10 to 12 slaves, quote, "shackled together with irons," on a steamboat travel that he made from Louisville to St. Louis in 1841. Lincoln said, quote, "That sight was a continual torment to me, and I see something like it every time I touch the Ohio River or any other slave border. The great body of the Northern people crucify their feelings in order to maintain their loyalty to the Constitution and the Union." So he's really, he really was started talking more and more about slavery was wrong, and it was absolutely wrong for it to grow and to have more areas or more states that would be slave states. 1856, that winter, Lincoln was rethinking his affiliation with the Whig Party, which was splintering, and he was considering joining the new Republican Party, which of course he eventually did. Ronald C. White Jr. wrote, quote, "The Republican train was gaining speed. Would Lincoln climb aboard?" 1856, Kansas was a battleground, as it was a territory scheduled to become a state on the road to statehood, and then under the Kansas-Nebraska Act, it could become a slave or a free state depending on the will of the people and how they voted. And there were pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces in Kansas. Basically, the Civil War started there. There was violence, destruction, buildings destroyed in Lawrence, Kansas, by pro-slavery quote-unquote, border ruffians from Missouri, who had the intent to strike terror into the rising free state population, folks who wanted the state to be free. Their so-called sack of Lawrence when this violence occurred. And this became national news, and it inspired or ignited the anti-slavery men in the North. On May 22nd, in the second, Charles Sumner of Massachusetts gave a speech called the Crime Against Kansas speech. And some days after that, he was attacked by the nephew of Preston Brooks of South Carolina and beaten into bloody unconsciousness with a cane. Now that speech, the speech that led to this attack, when he was attacked, he described Brooks's friend Andrew Butler of South Carolina as an aging, feeble Don Quixote, a chivalrous knight devoted to his beloved harlot, slavery. At his side, Stephen Douglas, the squire of slavery, its very Sancho Panza, ready to do all its humiliating offices. So the slavery, that's a nice. Those are nice references to Don Quixote, and that wonderful novel by the Spanish author Cervantes. Anyway, that speech was again part of this growing conflict, and certainly led to this severe, terrible thing. Sumner almost getting beaten to death in Congress. In May of 1856, the Republican State Convention took place in Illinois. In Bloomington, Abraham Lincoln attended and gave a speech for an hour and a half. And it sounds like he was either joining or had joined the Republican Party. Of course, he did join. And he said at that speech, quote, "The Union must be preserved in the purity of its principles as well as the integrity of its territorial parts." So he wanted the country to stay together, but he was very firm, Lincoln, that slavery could not be extended into the Northwest Territory. The Republicans had their first national convention in 1856 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Abraham Lincoln was a contender to be the Republican vice presidential candidate. On the first vote, Lincoln received 110 votes, which was second, and so you can see his growing power in the Republican Party. And Lincoln said, quote, "I reckon it's not me. There's another Lincoln down in Massachusetts. I have an idea he's the one." Well, it was Abraham Lincoln. He was, again, his self-deprecating humor. Now, the folks at that convention nominated John C. Fremont for president for the Republican Party and William Dayton vice president. Lincoln was not nominated as vice president. Lincoln made a major effort campaigning for Fremont, the Republican nominee, and he gave many speeches. The Democrats nominated James Buchanan. John C. Fremont was the son-in-law of Senator Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri. And during the campaign, Abraham Lincoln received many invitations to speak in Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Iowa. So he apparently did a lot of traveling and giving speeches for the Republican Party and John C. Fremont. And you can see Lincoln's growing national stature in the Republican Party. Lincoln gave a speech and he said this about the United States, quote, "The wonder and admiration of the world. What is it that has given the United States so much prosperity? That every man can make himself." Of course, that's why slavery was such a troublesome issue, because, of course, the slave could not prosper no matter how hard he worked. Now, in the election, Lincoln supported John C. Fremont. His wife, however, supported Millard Fillmore, who was the former president. And, he'd been, former president. So they were not united, the husband and wife, in that election. The Amboy Times, a newspaper, had this to say about Abraham Lincoln's speeches, quote, "His language is pure and respectful. He attacks no man's character or motives, but fights with arguments." And Mary had this to say about her husband, quote, "All that he desires is that slavery shall not be extended. Let it remain where it is." In the election, 83% of the eligible voters voted. The Democrat James Buchanan defeated the Republican candidate John C. Fremont to become the 15th president. Ronald C. White Jr. wrote, quote, "In less than 12 months, the Republican Party had become the strongest party in the North. The Republican candidate in 1860 would stand a real chance of winning the presidential election." Abraham Lincoln had played a key role in the 1856 election, and with his help, the Republicans won the complete state ticket in Illinois. And Abraham Lincoln was the leading Republican politician in Illinois at the end of 1856. Now, Lincoln was insecure, comparing himself to his political rival, Stephen Douglas, and he had this to say, quote, "20 years ago, Judge Davis and I first became acquainted. Even then, we were both ambitious, I perhaps quite as much as he. With me, the race of ambition has been a failure, a flat failure. With him, it has been one of splendid success." Douglas was in the Senate, and Lincoln was out of office. Stephen Douglas disdained African Americans. He was very racist. And now Lincoln, on the other hand, was at his ambition. He wanted oppressed people to rise. He wanted black people to do better for themselves. And he said, quote, "I would rather stand on that eminence than wear the richest crown that ever pressed a monarch's brow." Also in 1856, Abraham and Mary decided to renovate their home in Springfield, Illinois, transforming it from a modest cottage to a full 2-story house, adding a new east wing to the house. The architecture was Greek Revival with light brown paint and dark green shutters. Their fine home in Springfield. Now, the Dred Scott case in 1856 was before the Supreme Court. Dred Scott was a slave taken from Missouri, a slave state, to Illinois, a free state, and somehow he was able to get legal representation, most presumably from the abolitionist movement, and he's trying to argue that he should be free since he was in a free state. And in March of 1857, the Supreme Court, or the following year, the Supreme Court ruled, Supreme Court Justice Roger Taney said that blacks had, quote, been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations. So Taney ruled that Scott, even though he was a slave, that he was a slave in Illinois, even though Illinois was a slave state, and this really was allowing slavery in the North. There was a storm of protest in the North because that ruling was basically making free states slave states. Stephen Douglas, in one speech, had this to say about the Declaration of Independence, that the words, all men are created equal, referred to the white race alone. Now, there was 1856, this year, there was a stage version of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which became extremely popular. You know, this was like the movies of that era. And there were a lot of working class people going to watch Uncle Tom's Cabin. And David S. Reynolds, biographer, wrote about he wrote, quote, rowdy types who in former times had mobbed abolitionists, chased down fugitives from slavery, or harassed free blacks were suddenly caught up in Harriet Beecher Stowe's action-packed moving story, which invited viewers to sympathize with fugitives and hiss at a brutal slave owner. So yeah, Uncle Tom's Cabin really was helping to change public opinion in the North to make people more anti-slavery. And these people, again, who formerly would attack abolitionists or even free blacks, they were supportive because this moved them. So this is the power of mass entertainment or these Uncle Tom's Cabin, the book and the stage play. Regarding the effect of the play of Uncle Tom's Cabin, this biographer talked about the boys. These were B''Hoys, tough guys in New York City. The boys were on the side of the fugitives. The pro-slavery feeling had departed from among them. They believed in the higher law. Again, the changing of public opinion against slavery. Abraham Lincoln admired Euclid, the ancient Greek who was the father of geometry. Lincoln said, quote, Euclid, well studied, would free the world of half its calamities by banishing half the nonsense which now dilutes it and curses it. Again, he was a very busy guy, married, 2 sons, and he was given all these speeches. Here we're into 1857, and his legal career he was busy with that. Half of his cases were debt litigation, a fifth inheritance or mortgage, and mortgage foreclosure. 15% dealt with crime and divorce, 5% railroads, 1% medicine, and 8% miscellaneous. So he was very busy with his legal career and giving speeches. Regarding the Dred Scott Supreme Court decision, Abraham Lincoln did not agree with those who advocated resisting the court ruling, and he said, quote, but we think the Dred Scott decision is erroneous. We know the court that made it has often overruled its own decisions, and we shall do what we can to have it overrule this. Abraham Lincoln was a strong believer in the rule of law. He thought this was a terrible decision, and again, like he said, was hoping they would change their decision later. In the dissenting opinion, Justice Benjamin Curtis said that 5 of the original 13 U.S. states had free blacks with the right to vote, and they played a role in the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. So that's some important history. Regarding African American slaves in 1857, Abraham Lincoln said, quote, all the powers of earth seem rapidly combining against him. Mammon is after him. Ambition follows, and philosophy follows, and the theology of the day is fast joining the cry. They have him in his prison house. They have searched his person and left no prying instrument with him. One after another they have closed the heavy iron doors upon him, and now they have him bolted in with a lock of 100 keys. So you can see he was referring here to how the slavery or the ideas of slavery, that it was important or it was justified, even having Christian ministers saying, "Oh yes, it's the slave has to accept his fate," or saying that it was fine because there's slavery in the Bible. So he's really You can see how sympathetic he was to slaves. This very terrible situation that they were in. Abraham Lincoln, he believed that the signers of the Declaration of Independence, when they signed their approval to Thomas Jefferson's words, "All men are created equal," and of course, at the same time, slavery existed, which was a contradiction of those words in 1776. Lincoln believed that they were thinking of the future, and that the enforcement of this right, quote, "might follow as fast as circumstances should permit." Lincoln hoped that now this was an intention. You hear they're saying all men are created equal, that they wanted, it was not reality, obviously, for the slaves, but they hoped it would be. And Lincoln said that he hoped that the maxim, "all men are created equal," should be, quote, "constantly looked to, constantly approximated, and thereby constantly spreading and deepening its influence and augmenting a happiness and value of life to all people of all colors everywhere." That these words, "all men are created equal," were an ideal that the country should strive to make real. Again, he was very busy during this time, 1857, with his law practice. In the middle of the 1850s, during this time, the picturesque romantic travel on the Mississippi River that soon inspired Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn was coming to an end, because railroads snaked across the land, and where they were crossing the Mississippi River, making it more complicated to travel by water on the Mississippi. The first bridge spanning the Mississippi River from Rock Island, Illinois, to Davenport, Iowa, opened April 21st, 1856. Only a couple weeks later, the steamboat Effie Afton had a collision with the bridge. And of course, this was a drawbridge that would go up and down apparently. And the steamboat collided with the bridge. The ship sank. The bridge caught on fire and collapsed into the river. There was a lawsuit as a result. The owner of the steamboat filed suit against the Rock Island Railway. Now, this was a conflict, a national conflict between Chicago and railroads and east-west travel versus St. Louis and riverboats and north-south travel. The country traditionally, the Mississippi River system is north-south, but the country was expanding east-west, and this new transportation method, railroads were allowing western travel and expansion. Now, Lincoln decided to support the railroad companies in court. And he argued that the growth of the West was because of railroads and the east-west travel. The country needed railroads to expand westward. And he blamed the ship captain in this case for carelessness. And so it was basically a conflict between the past and the future. The past, the river boats traveling on the Mississippi, and then the present, which was railroads going east to west. Lincoln himself had traveled the Mississippi as a teenager to New Orleans. Railroads were the future, and the Mississippi boat travel was something was coming to an end, or at least lessening its importance as railroad travel became much more important. That concludes today's presentation. We'll continue next time with Part 6 of the fascinating, inspiring life of Abraham Lincoln. I hope you have a good history book to read or find one. There's so many wonderful history books. You might consider checking out our website, Adventures in History with Peter J. Ray at peterjray.com. So far, we've made 719 history videos in 7 areas: world history, American history, book reviews, poetic tours, Cleveland baseball, family history, and autobiography. There's a donate feature. You might consider making a donation so we can continue making these videos. If you live in Metro Manila, Philippines, and are looking for a high school, you might consider Restless Educational Center. Restless is located on Allenby Street in San Juan, Metro Manila, Philippines, not far from the corner of P. Guevara and Wilson Street. At Restless, we specialize in helping young people who have had difficulty in the larger traditional high schools. We're more than a school. We are a warm, supportive community, and we strive to be creative and innovative so the students enjoy learning and enjoy going going to school. And the website is restless.education, Resalest. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. God bless you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.